Our short introductive story begins in 1989. Two writers for the Japanese magazine Gamist record footage for a VHS tape demonstrating Sega's recently released arcade version of Tetris. This tape will go on to be a massive hit, almost as much as the game it features. It is, for many people, a crucial guide on how to play Tetris effectively, if not also their first introduction to the game. Over the next year, reaching the maximum score in Sega's Tetris becomes such a common feat that top players are competing to see how fast they can do it. While American arcades are on a slow decline towards mediocrity, Japan harbors a growing scene of dedicated hardcore players. A Tetris player hears that a new game has arrived at an arcade in Ofuna a week before its intended release date. He leaves work at 10 PM, and since he is still an hour away, he runs to the bus stop in the rain. And he slips. He lands face first. His face is bleeding, his glasses are broken, leaving him barely able to see, his wrist is sprained. Undeterred, he decides to call a different arcade near Kawasaki Station and finds out that they too have a machine up and running. The man lumbers into the arcade and gets just 3 runs in. Soaking wet, covered in blood, in pain and with no glasses, he still manages to make it to the credit roll. He is one of the first people in the country to do so. This is the second game in a series built specifically for the most dedicated Tetris players. It's 2003. A French player sends to his friend a screenshot of an emulated version of Tetris the Grandmaster, the first game in the series. At this point, he is the only player outside of Japan who has achieved the rank of GM. The total number of people playing the game outside Japan is likely a single digit. 2 years later, the number of GMs has increased to 4. By 2009, there are 35. 2010. The creator of the TGM series announces on his personal blog that after a year of fighting for a publishing deal, the latest game in the series cannot be released. The majority of his despair is directed towards overseas players who cannot visit Japanese arcades and are forced to play on emulators and clones of the series. An American player tags him on Twitter with an image of his new personal best on an imported game board, accompanied with the caption, "We love TGM." The creator replies saying that if he really liked TGM, he should stop playing clones. 2025. A YouTuber talks into a microphone about the history of the Tetris the Grandmaster series. That's me, hello. If you're already a fan of the series and you're not from Japan, your first exposure to it was likely a viral YouTube video. These days a lot of people have seen clips of at least one of the games, but comparatively few have taken the leap of actually giving it a go. And that's fair, they're designed to be difficult games. But they're also intensely rewarding, and for that reason I would still classify the series as underrated. It is also a series packed with history. 4 decades of history if you start from the roots. So this video will be split into 4 parts. Not precisely 1 decade per part, as much as I would have liked that, but there will be interesting moments throughout. This is not, however, a happy story. It is a story of struggle, compromise, petty rivalry, and at times, massive disappointment. If it is a story you haven't heard, you will likely grow disillusioned as we progress. But, at the end, you will be rewarded. Do you want to know how it feels to go through the gauntlet of becoming a Grandmaster? This is how it feels. But I mean, it's a niche video game series. How bad could it be? Following a low period in the mid-1980s, the latter half of the decade saw a remarkable resurgence of arcade games. Although it had to compete with recent home console powerhouses such as the NES and the later release of the handheld Game Boy, the arcade scene was beginning to offer a range of new titles with advanced graphics and enticing mechanics. Racing games such as Outrun and beat-em-ups such as Double Dragon helped re-cement arcades as major centers of entertainment, especially in Japan. Fall 1988. Atari, long one of the leading arcade developers in North America, had recently released their own take on the Soviet mind game Tetris to American arcades. Sega, having recently secured the arcade rights from Atari for Tetris in Japan, was now tasked with producing an interpretation of their own. Their board of choice for the project was the System 16, an early 16-bit system first released in 1985. Although the board was limited to 128 sprites on screen at a time, which occasionally necessitated workarounds, it more than made up for it with its power. After around half a year of development, Tetris was released to Japanese arcades in early December 1988. Although noticeably simple in its graphics, especially compared to the popular arcade games of the era, Sega's rendition of Tetris has a few features that make it stand out from the contemporary Tetris repertoire. Most notably, and likely a result of arcade owners' desires to produce difficult-to-master games that kept people coming back, the later levels see the pieces fall at speeds seldom seen at the time. The fastest of the game's speeds sees the pieces drop one tile every frame, equivalent to the entire height of the board in just a third of a second. Playing this would be nigh impossible with the mechanics seen in existing versions of Tetris, so in order to make continuous play feasible at this speed, two novel design choices are introduced. The first is an exceptionally fast dash, the speed at which pieces move side to side while holding a button. This allows for a much wider variety of moves, at the cost of some precise control. The other feature is what's known as lock delay. When a piece lands, it remains active for half a second before locking, and during this time the player is still free to move or rotate it. Not only does this provide more control to the player, but it also makes fitting pieces into gaps a lot easier. So, despite being graphically basic and somewhat difficult to control, the game offers a high skill ceiling while remaining forgiving enough to still reward casual players. For all its innovations, however, the game also has some major drawbacks. For one, it only lets you rotate counterclockwise, although some arcade cabinets came with 3 rotation buttons, which could be pressed in rapid succession to simulate a clockwise rotation. In addition, for some fucking reason, the ceiling of the board prevents rotation, meaning at the slower speeds you have to either tap the soft drop or awkwardly wait for the piece to drop before you can rotate it, an issue that most other forms of Tetris at the time didn't present. Nevertheless, the game was still unique, and crucially, it had depth to offer. It's worth noting that at the time of release, Sega's management were still in serious doubt about the game's appeal in the current action-packed arcade sphere. This sounds silly nowadays, but Tetris had only entered the Japanese market in November after the release of Bulletproof Software's PC and Famicom versions, and they acquired the rights after Sega. More on that later. In fact, it's likely Sega's management never would have approved the game at all if it was pitched the normal way. It was only considered because they had verifiable proof of its addictiveness. Earlier that year, one of the company's developers had written a basic version of the game for internal use, and it was quickly getting passed around and built upon until it was beginning to distract people from their work, eventually ending in a department-wide Tetris ban. This is a recurring story. Mirasoft had experienced the same set of events back in '87, and Russian institutions had been banning the game and destroying discs as far back as '86. All this to say, it's no surprise that Sega's new arcade game was an immediate smash hit. Nearly overnight, it had become one of the highest earning arcade titles in the country. By mid-January, it was already first place on Game Machine's Best Hit Games list, beating out the second place game by a considerable margin. The biggest surprise though is that it held first place for the entire year, and it kept its position near the top of the list well into 1990, an unparalleled achievement in a gaming scene with new hit games coming out practically every month. Thanks to its persistent popularity, Game Machine would end up crowning it as their overall top game for 1989 and 1990. Gamist also awarded the game its 1989 grand prize, complete with an illustrated front cover. This monkey is horrifying. It's nowhere near this creepy in the game. Why did they draw it like this? If you look up images of Sega's Tetris, you'll occasionally find versions that look a bit different. This is because the game was so lucrative that Sega ended up repurposing its 8-bit System E board to play a similar version, and Taito began to repurpose some of their less popular cabinets as well. Although with no access to the original game's source code, their development team had to recreate the sound and graphics from scratch, guided only by a series of VHS recordings, which is damn impressive. There's no other way to slice it. This was arcade domination. The effect Sega's Tetris had on the Japanese arcade scene cannot be overstated. Unlike most of the existing racing and fighting games, Tetris attracted a wave of more casual players that in turn helped develop the image of arcades as a place for all types of people. Unsurprisingly, the monumental popularity of the game inevitably led to quick mastery by many of the more motivated players. You probably noticed the score counter caps out at a measly 1 million, and the lines counter at 999, both relatively achievable feats once you adapt to the maximum speed, so players began to set their own challenges. Although it was certainly cheaty, hitting the maximum score as fast as possible could be made a lot easier by memorizing the power-on pattern, a specific sequence of pieces that would always be dealt on the first game after the system started up. Another common way to show off your skill as a player was to build special shapes, such as this design with a V-shaped gap running through it. Performances were becoming the next big thing. Unfortunately, this was not the only thing that happened after the game's release. Despite the surprise success of Tetris in arcades, it was about to become Sega's most volatile item.
It doesn't necessarily take violence to make a bestseller video game. One of the all-time hits is Spectrum Holobyte's Tetris, written by a Russian programmer, Alexei Pajitnov.
Soon after the European Mirrorsoft had sold Japanese arcade rights to Sega through Atari, its American sister company, Spectrum Holobyte, was selling Japanese computer rights to Henk Rogers and his company, Bulletproof Software, with plans to sell him console and arcade rights as well. You might notice an issue here. After the computer deal was signed, Spectrum Holobyte's chairman, Gilman Louie, called Mirrorsoft's chairman, Jim Makinouchi, to report on it. Makinouchi was livid. As it turned out, Louie had no idea that Mirrorsoft had already sold Japanese and American Tetris rights to Atari, including the rights Rogers was seeking. These rights should have been Louie's, and Rogers was offering a better deal, but unfortunately the Maxwell family, who owned both companies, already supported Makinouchi's deal. So Louie had no choice but to cancel the pending deals, although Rogers was lucky enough to keep the computer deal he had already made. Rogers contacted Atari about the other two systems, and he was informed that although Sega had already acquired Japanese arcade rights, he could still have the console rights, and soon he had created his own Tetris ports for the Japanese market. Around the same time, Nintendo of America's Minoru Arakawa was looking to launch the company's in-development Game Boy with Tetris as its flagship game. So, in a meeting with Rogers, he tasked him with acquiring the rights for handheld Tetris. Okay, hold on. We need to talk about this meeting. A couple of years ago, the Tetris movie came out. It's your basic Hollywood drama, the kind you put on in the background while you make dinner. It's mainly notable for Hank's portrayal by Taron Egerton, who couldn't look less like him, and also for the sheer number of things the movie embellishes, including a scene with Hank and Alexei in a car chase against the KGB? Sure, okay. Possibly the funniest embellishment, however, is this meeting. These are our relevant characters: Henk Rogers, Bulletproof Software, Minoru Arakawa, President of Nintendo of America, and Howard Lincoln, Senior Vice President and Arakawa's BFF. Henk is shown a prototype Game Boy with Super Mario Land and told the game was programmed in C. So, naturally, he goes up to the computer in the lab and hammers out a perfectly working Game Boy Tetris in like 5 minutes. Arakawa is impressed with the game, which Henk uses to make his pitch that if Nintendo wants to sell the Game Boy to little kids, they should package it with Mario, but if they want to sell it to everyone, they should package it with Tetris. Now, Henk definitely did not program Game Boy Tetris by himself in 5 minutes, but in interviews he mentions this pitch a lot.
I said, well, if you want little boys to buy your Game Boy,
then pack in Mario.
But if you want everyone to buy your Game Boy, then include Tetris. Game Boy will be for everybody.
And I mean, I get it. If I said something like that, I'd mention that story all the time too. But while researching for this video, I read David Sheff's 1993 book, Game Over. It covers the history of Nintendo, of which Tetris was a core part, and the author interviewed a lot of major figures, including Lincoln and Arakawa. So, let's see what it has to say about the lead up to Hank's meeting.
Minoru Arakawa first saw a prototype of Game Boy in Kyoto in 1987 and promptly topped Yamauchi's predictions. Before it was over, 100 million Game Boys would sell throughout the world, he said. To reach such astronomical levels, however, it would need a monster game, and Arakawa saw it at an arcade industry trade show in June 1988, where Randy Rowlett of Atari Games was showing off a prototype of an arcade version of a game called Tetris. At the convention with Howard Lincoln, Arakawa stood in front of the console and played, transfixed. Back in Redmond, Arakawa's engineers created a test version of Tetris that worked with a prototype Game Boy. His lawyers had figured out that Microsoft was probably tap dancing around the fact that it didn't have the rights. Indeed, it was possible that no one owned the handheld rights. That is when Arakawa decided it might be beneficial to try other avenues to get the game. In a meeting with Hank Rogers, Arakawa made an offer. If Rogers could get the handheld rights, Nintendo of America would take out a sub-license from him. Rogers was let in on the still-secret reason that Arakawa wanted Tetris. He was shown a prototype of Game Boy.
This is a decidedly different story. A 2004 documentary on Tetris also seems to back this up.
Industry giant Nintendo were about to launch a handheld game playing device and wanted to sell Tetris as part of the package. But first, they needed someone to discreetly secure them the rights.
We showed Hank Rogers a prototype of Game Boy and a prototype of Tetris playing on Game Boy. So he immediately moved very quickly.
This documentary interviews both Lincoln and Rogers, so did he just not mention his pitch to these guys? Or did he change his story once he realized how cool it sounds to claim you pitched Tetris to Nintendo? That can't be right. I would get his recent book to see if he expands upon his side of the story, but more likely than not, it just says the same thing he says in all his interviews. Luckily, Dan Ackerman's 2016 book, The Tetris Effect, comes in to shed some light on the situation. Having interviewed multiple key people, Dan arrives at the same conundrum of conflicting stories. He doesn't dispute Rogers' claim, but he does say this.
If Arakawa had acted surprised by Rogers' proposal of Tetris as the perfect game for the Game Boy hardware, he was simply playing his cards especially close to the vest. In truth, Tetris was already on his radar and had been for some time. Nintendo's own R&D engineers had pitched Arakawa on the game, and even now there was work going on to produce a prototype cartridge to discern the feasibility of the game for the Game Boy's small black and white screen.
Personally, I'm not buying Hank's story. Literally, his book's $40, I'm not buying that. But I will concur that his pitch may really have happened, even if he was preaching to the choir. And don't let this initial story ruin what you think of him. He did do some awesome things, as you'll soon see. Late 1988, Lincoln and Arakawa had tasked Rogers with obtaining handheld Tetris rights. In November, Rogers went straight to Robert Stein and was promised that a deal with the Russians for handheld rights was forthcoming. However, what Rogers and the other licensees didn't know was that at this point Stein didn't even have the arcade rights that had already been passed down to Atari and Sega. The holdup was that Microsoft wasn't paying Stein royalties, and until he could pass that money along to the Russians, they were refusing to agree to any more deals. After months of waiting, Rogers had grown increasingly impatient and was losing confidence that Stein would be able to get him the rights in time, if at all, and so in February of 1989, he decided to travel to the Soviet Union himself and secure handheld rights from Alorg, the recently formed organization with authority over all exports of Soviet computer software. As it happened, unbeknownst to Rogers, both Stein and Microsoft's president Kevin Maxwell also independently arrived at Alorg at the same time to secure various rights for themselves. While meeting with Alorg president Nikolai Belikov, Rogers presented to him a Famicom Tetris cartridge, and he also mentioned Sega's recent arcade release in passing. Both of these came as a surprise to Belikov, who believed the rights given to Stein only regarded computer systems. Rogers requested a copy of the original contract, and he realized that it was vague in what it defined as a computer, which meant at the very least games made for consoles weren't illegal. However, However, the two arcade games on the market were. Belikov, feeling justifiably shortchanged and pulled along by Stein, was eager to revoke his rights and set up a new contract that explicitly limited him to computer systems while offering Rogers and Nintendo the rights for both console and handheld devices. It worked. Against all odds, it worked. Stein had signed the new contract before he realized the updated definition of computer had stripped his video game rights, and Belikov had ignored an offer from the Maxwells, who were friends with the Russian government, because at the end of the day, Nintendo was offering far more. Now armed with definitive rights, Nintendo immediately began battle against Atari, who had just ported their version of Tetris to the NES with millions spent on marketing. They had no clue what had just happened. They still thought the rights were theirs, so they fought back, but they had no chance in court. Nintendo had plans to bring in both Belikov and Alexei Pajitnov to testify, but there was no need, as the judge quickly ruled in their favor and granted them a preliminary injunction against Atari, forcing them to take hundreds of thousands of their brand new game cartridges off the shelves. The hammer blow was swift and decisive. If you haven't heard the full story of Tetris, this barely scratches the surface. There's a whole trove of wild anecdotes, but others have already covered this in far greater detail than I ever could. I highly recommend David Sheff's book, as well as Gaming Historian's video on the subject. What really matters to us is who got the arcade rights in the end. It was good news for Atari and Sega. In the process of accidentally signing away his console rights, Stein had finally managed a contract with Alorg for arcade rights, meaning they wouldn't have to pull their cabinets. Unluckily, however, just as Atari had been porting their game to the NES, Sega had also been working on a port for the Mega Drive, which, despite being ready to release by April, was now stuck in limbo. This new version, like Atari's doomed NES port, had some new features that would have elevated it above the arcade version, such as a time trial mode and a doubles mode where two players could play on the same board. And you can rotate in both directions now. Of course, since their bitter rival Nintendo now held all the cards for console Tetris, Sega begrudgingly decided that their safest bet would be to destroy every copy of the game. It's not known exactly how many of the original copies survived, but it's likely a single-digit figure. Only 4 can be pinpointed today. It's for this reason that the Mega Drive version of Tetris is often claimed to be the rarest Tetris game, and that may be true in terms of physical copies, but it was eventually released to limited success on the Megatech, an arcade cabinet that could play Mega Drive games. The game was also re-released as part of a PlayStation 2 collection in 2006, finally allowing the public to play it at home. Let's imagine you're Sega. It's April 1989 and you're looking to capitalize on your outrageously popular arcade game with some kind of sequel. Bad news, Nintendo just snatched the game's console rights out from under you, and now you're gonna have to throw your already finished console port in the dumpster. And Nintendo's saying the only reason they didn't take your arcade rights too is because they didn't feel like it. That's not reassuring. This Tetris IP is looking pretty volatile. This probably isn't the only reason, but it's at least part of the reason that Sega decided their best bet was to change up the mechanics a bit and release their Tetris-ish follow-up under an entirely new name. Enter Flashpoint. This game is weird. It released in July, and the main difference from Tetris is that instead of simply clearing lines until you lose, your goal is to beat a series of stages by clearing the flashing blocks. That's basically it. Even the speed curve is the same, but an interesting addition is a switch on the board that would enable 2-cell mode, an even more brutal speed than the usual limit where pieces drop 2 blocks per frame. This was designed to be a kill screen to stop people from playing too long. It only activates 25 minutes into each credit, but it was still possible to play, so for top players it was a welcome challenge. You can tell Sega had no idea whether to brand this as a Tetris game because there's no license information in the game or the flyers, and also because hidden in the game's code is a completed but cut second mode that's effectively just regular Tetris. Very weird. Remember when I said Tetris kept its #1 spot across all of 1989? I may have lied, a little bit. In the end, Sega had outdone themselves, as Flashpoint briefly knocked Tetris down to 2nd place when it debuted on the rankings in September. It did drop from the #1 spot pretty quickly after the initial hype ended, but the game has some replayability, so it's bound to stick around for a while. Oh. This little gap is because the game's rating wasn't even recorded, since it had already dropped off the top 25. By May 1990 it was gone. You know what, maybe this one just missed the mark. No problem, by December Sega had sorted out their license and completed their trilogy with Block Seed. This one's even closer to the original Tetris, just with some new gimmicks. This time there are quote-unquote garbage lines that appear at the bottom of the screen and push your stack upwards, and there are power blocks that assist you in various ways. So let's see how well it ranks, and it's the exact same. Didn't even break first place this time. Funnily enough, just as Game Machine's end-of-year rankings showed Tetris in first place across 2 years, Flashpoint ended both 1989 and 1990 in 17th, with Block Seed in 13th for 1990. It's worth pointing out that by general arcade standards, this wasn't bad. These games were still successful, but considering this was right in the middle of Tetris mania, they definitely didn't do as well as Sega was hoping. So what did they miss? This sounds obvious, but Tetris's broad appeal is in its simplicity. The best Tetris game is deceptively simple, easy to get into but with a high skill ceiling, so the only way to improve is to think and stack faster. Any new game with challenging gimmicks necessarily asks you to master those gimmicks, and so the game feels like a side mode when compared with the depth that base Tetris can offer. This is what happened with Flashpoint and Block Seed. There was an initial burst of attention as people tried it out, but since the games feel more like side modes than sequels, players got a good score or two and went back to Tetris. After Block Seed, Sega realized this and moved on to other games while the Tetris money rolled in. Bulletproof Software did not realize this. In December 1991, they released Tetris 2 plus Bombless, followed by Tetris Battle Guided in 1993, then Super Tetris 3 in 1994. But these were all for consoles. Japanese arcades wouldn't see a new Tetris game until Jellicoe's Tetris Plus in late 95. And even that couldn't help but include a gimmick mode itself. Still, it was successful enough to spawn some home console ports and an unremarkable sequel. If you ask an older person what classic Tetris games they remember, it won't be any of these. Game Machine released its final issue in June 2002. Its biggest headline in the Overseas Readers section is that for the first time in over 5 years, Sega might soon turn a profit again. This prediction couldn't have been further off. The following year would turn out so poorly the company would nearly disappear entirely. They had been bleeding money struggling to capture a share of the now fiercely competitive console market, so they were left with really only one thing still keeping them afloat: arcade games. On the previous page, still clinging on to the end of the best hit games list, their 14-year-old game sat quietly. It's the most profitable arcade game they ever made. So what, that's it? Is Tetris immune to innovation? Despite the picture I've been painting, I can promise you it isn't. There is a path. It slipped by Sega and Nintendo and BPS because they were chasing the broad family appeal the series was already providing. And that's fine, it did make them a lot of money, but for Tetris to properly evolve, it could only be done through the fans themselves, the most dedicated players. Our story proper begins in 1987 with the release of the Sharp X68000.
黄金のグラフィックスを持ったシャープ X68000。
Although ostensibly a home computer, the X68K was built with graphics hardware designed to operate similarly to the arcade cabinets of the time. In addition, the monitor's analog RGB input and variable scanning rate allowed it to double as a display for existing arcade boards. This made it a suitable choice for designing and developing arcade games at the time. Fast forward to late 1989. A person going by the name of Jun Shimizu began sharing a freeware game with the name Tetris SEMIPRO 68K, which would eventually grow to be known by its colloquial name, Shimizu Tetris. It's a visually basic Tetris fan game for the X68K, with many of the mechanics borrowed from Sega's arcade version. However, the deceptively simple look of SEMIPRO hides a wealth of features. Entering one-player mode, you'll find that considerably more information is provided to the player than in Sega's version, along with a wider range of difficulties. In addition, the board width is configurable, from 4 all the way up to 34 tiles. The rotation ceiling is still present, but at least there are now separate buttons for clockwise and counterclockwise rotation. The creator didn't put quite as much effort into the sound design. The only music available is the standard theme that comes with the X68K, and the sound effects are ripped straight from Gradius 2, including a vile roaring sound every 10 levels. Our other options are 2-player mode, allowing for a simultaneous play, doubles mode from the cancelled Mega Drive Tetris, versus mode, and a recreation of Flashpoint. Moving into the configuration tab, we're greeted with the option to switch to Pentaminos, a unique option for the time, and one that makes gameplay significantly more difficult. Still, it's a fun challenge. We also have the option for a second next piece, or none at all, an option for the piece sequence featuring Noble, which replicates the power on pattern, additional options for the 2-player modes, and Block Birth, a gimmick which creates single blocks each time a piece is placed. The timing settings for things such as the lock delay and the wait between pieces are also adjustable. These things on their own are interesting, but not exactly mind-blowing. However, the most innovative feature SEMIPRO offers is actually its most challenging difficulty. There are 3 difficulties I neglected to show earlier. 2-cell, same as the Flashpoint kill screen, 3-cell, and finally 20-cell, where the pieces drop 20 blocks per frame, the entire height of the board. At this speed, pieces practically appear on your stack, giving you just the half-second lock delay to move them into position. This presents a novel challenge. Both your movement and rotation options are severely limited, requiring you to completely rethink how you stack to avoid difficult positions. Sega's restrictive rotation mechanics make this difficulty especially frustrating, so it stands largely as an extra challenge for seasoned players.
You need some practice.
I do need some practice. Practice is clearly the name of the game here. SEMIPRO was pretty obviously designed as a training tool for players of Sega's Tetris and Flashpoint. But on top of practicing for the real games, it offers an alternative to travelling to the arcade, and crucially, it's a free alternative. This is the point that's ethically muddy, and the legality and impact of sharing a Tetris fan game is a complex topic that'll be covered later. But that's not something SEMIPRO would have to worry about. The game spread was likely severely limited by the requirement of owning an X68K, of which the basic model was selling for the equivalent of $5,500 in today's money. Unfortunately, it's difficult to say much about the game's origin or how many people played it, as information today is frustratingly scarce. In fact, even the identity of the game's creator isn't certain. Jun Shimizu does appear prominently in the credits for the Mega Drive port of the 1986 arcade game Slap Fight, as well as brief mentions in the credits for other games, including some for the X68K. If this really is the creator, then it's likely SEMIPRO was just a side project of a young arcade developer who happened to be a fan of Tetris. The game was destined to never achieve fame, and maybe that's how it was intended, but likely on accident it offered a glimpse into a simple, natural path that could potentially bring a brand new era of incredibly impressive skill. Casual Tetris will go its own way. Later down the line, Henk and Alexei will take back control of the rights and forge their own path. We'll check in on them again later. In the meantime, all the pieces are here to create a pure and true test of brainpower. It is to be, dare I say, not just a paradigm shift for Tetris, but the ultimate puzzle game. These pieces will sit here until, eventually, they are picked up by someone with the vision to bring it all together. That person will be our shepherd, our grand architect, and from then on, our story will be at their whim. Let's hope they're up to the task.